All right, I'm gonna give it about an additional 2 to 3 minutes for us to finish that game, because I will need to open the report and so that we can discuss where you are lacking or which questions are more difficult for you, because we need to see that part. So if you're still playing the game, please play it quickly for the next 3 minutes, and then we're gonna continue with class. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participation in the quizzes. I can see some of you are still playing the game, and I think we will all agree it was fun, quite fun. I'm able to see the leaderboard score. If you also agree it was fun and so on, in the emoji box there or in the chat box, just type a smiley face there or show your emotions. We're using a smiley if you're not happy, angry face, sad face, anything, because I need your participation in this class session. Also need to know that you are also here and you are able to hear me very well. So it's also about showing the screen. So I'm gonna end the game. So on your device, it will end as well. Sorry if you're still playing the game, but I need to see the report so that we can see where you are lacking. So based on this, I've noticed there was a question as well asking about your level of satisfaction regarding the class. So that question was automatically, there was no correct answer, so it affected that. But I can see the one that you struggled a lot, let's say question 6, there was no correct answer. So let's look at question 6. Basically, so the question was indicate a suitable type of research design for the following research project. And the research project was how does the image of an ideal man influence the male population between the age of 20 and 35. So this is a research study whereby they want to explore basically whether males, especially the young boys and so on, or the young adults between the age of 20 to 35, if they are still influenced by an image of an ideal man. So if we describe an ideal man, you will see that we are exploring is not something that you can describe easily, because we have ideal men. This could be your role models. An ideal man could be some people you see in the magazine, a soccer star, and so on. Does it influence the population? So here we could not ask close-ended questions, meaning that it could not be a quantitative study. We need them to be in a discussion group and tell us basically their opinions. So that's why the correct answer basically here, it's qualitative, it's exploratory, it's not quantitative. But 4 players got it correct, so that's good. So 40%. So as I was reviewing questions, I wanted the one about 0, so not the one about 40%. Okay, here is question 6. Let's see if it shows. Review questions. Oh, this is question 1. So let's go to question 6. Yeah, this is where most of you got the incorrect answer. So indicate a suitable type of research design for the following research project. So in this case, the research project was did the role models of marriage and motherhood as perceived by 20 to 30 years old women in our society change? If so, how did they change? So you'll see with this research study, it's also similar to that one of the role models of males. So this one was about in terms of females. So in this case, we also needed these people to express their opinions. So it was going to be qualitative, it's not quantitative. So this question or your answers here show me that somehow maybe you still need to understand more about qualitative studies. So please use that table in a textbook. So I'll reference the table once again because we use those points. So always use that table on page 73 in the textbook. So if you're having a textbook with you and you go to page 173, you will see it differentiate between exploratory, descriptive, and causal. And most of the time, we use two things to differentiate between these studies. We talk about the sample which are people that we interview. So with qualitative, it's a small sample, and then whether we want to use numbers or we are using qualitative information, which is in-depth interviews, focus groups. So even here, for us to answer these questions, we needed to take females between the age of 20 to 30, put them in a focus group or do some sort of in-depth interview with them and ask them questions, and they will have to express their opinion if they still perceive a motherhood or the marriage as in olden days in the past 10 years. And if it has changed, it's about independence now and so on. How did it change? They'll need to express, so hence it was qualitative study. So reviewing the questions as well, I see question 4, you did well with that. So basically today I wanted to introduce you to quizzes, because as we continue with our online class sessions, we'll be using more of the quizzes. So I want you to be familiar with quizzes. So I think we've achieved that. So let's go to chapter 6. And in the textbook on page 87, collection of secondary data. And as I have indicated, in the research proposal, we'll cover this element. So in this chapter, we will outline the process of collecting secondary data. You should make sure that you understand that. We'll define what is secondary data. We'll differentiate it between primary and secondary data. We'll talk about when to use secondary data instead of primary data. We've got different types of secondary data, which goes to the research proposal. We're talking about the internal, the external, and the different sources. For example, your Google Scholar, the magazines, and so on. So we're going to talk about those different sources, as well as how you can actually assess the reliability of external secondary information, because at some stage you'll be collecting this secondary data and you need to know basically if you can rely on it. Is it reliable? Is it fake news? Is it a scam, and so on? So let's first differentiate between secondary data and primary data. So in the textbook, you can highlight at the bottom where it talks about secondary data. It's under the paragraph written secondary data, but they tell you what is primary data first there. So you can highlight the first line. Primary data, it's collected to solve the marketing problem, take advantage of the opportunity facing management. It is collected from scratch, and then they talk about secondary data in the next sentence, which is the third line. It's the data that already exists, that is secondary data. It has been previously gathered for some other purpose and not for the specific study. And then on the slide, you'll see that table which summarizes it. So secondary data, we say it's old, it already exists, which means it was collected before, but for another purpose. The advantage of using secondary data is that it is available and it's cheaper or cost effective. So meaning that basically you can go to library or you can go to internet. It's not expensive as primary data. With primary data is the new data that we're gonna collect. So this is when we ask people like a survey or interviews. So that will be collected to solve the current problem that the interviewer or the researchers are facing. It's a time-consuming process because usually you'll need to analyze that data, transcribe it. If it's interviews, listening to recordings and so on, as well as to interpret the findings. So it takes quite a while. But it's a fresh data rather than the outdated data. The disadvantage with secondary data is that it's usually outdated, meaning that we cannot rely on information that is too old at some stages. So in the textbook, I also need you to highlight on the next page, page 88. page 88, where they talk about the important uses of secondary data. So you will see about 6 bullets there. Just before those 6 bullets on page 88, you can highlight the most important uses of secondary data there. What it means is talking about why it's important for us to collect secondary data and how we can use it. So the first point that they're making here, to formulate the decision making. When we do a research proposal, we develop hypotheses. And when we develop hypotheses, basically we are making an assumption, which is a decision making problem. So a decision making problem, before we come to hypothesis, by collecting secondary data, we interpret secondary data and we understand the study more, and it allows us to formulate those hypotheses or decision-making problem. To suggest methods and types of data for meeting information needs, this it talks about different methods of collecting primary data. So if you collect primary data, you will use surveys, you will use observations, you will use telephone interviews, face-to-face interviews, different methods. But those methods have implications. So if, for example, I use face-to-face interviews, I will know that I will be able to have time and explain some of the words to the respondents. But when I'm using the web survey, I don't have that face-to-face interpretation or discussion. So each and every method has implication, and then this implication will apply when we look at the validity of your own research proposal. So you must choose the correct data collection method based on what others have used. So for you to find out what methods they have used, you will obviously collect secondary data, meaning that you will download articles, research articles similar to your topic, and then you look at the methods that they have used. And then this secondary data we're referring to, it will suggest methods for you to collect the information appropriately. To interpret and evaluate primary data, once you've collected your primary data in the research proposal, meaning that you have interviewed all your respondents, you come to interpreting your findings. So when you interpret your findings, you want to compare with previous studies. So secondary data, it becomes very important to be used as well to say, are my findings similar to the findings of a different author, which was the research was conducted 5 years ago, or they are different? Why are they different, and so on. So you can use secondary data to interpret and evaluate the new data that you get. To monitor the enterprise external environment, this you learn a lot in under marketing as a module. Your external environment, where we talk about your economy, even your market environment, your consumers, your competitors. Secondary data is helpful for that. So when you collect it, you are able to learn about them, because you can basically learn about their market share, their products, and so on. To provide the basis for final decision making, it's similar to the first one. Basically, we're talking about formulating hypothesis. A basis, remember, it's an introduction state. It's in the introduction statement, meaning that we assume this will happen. So it's a hypothesis. So for secondary data helps us to develop those hypotheses, and then they become our basis for final decision making once we've collected the primary data. And lastly, secondary data is useful or it's important in longitudinal research studies. So the word longitudinal studies, it comes from the word, the first 4 letters that you have there, a long study. So when we talk about longitudinal studies, we're talking about a study that takes years, a number of years. We're talking about, could be 20 years conducting this research, or it could be even 100 years. The oldest study that I know, which is a longitudinal study, I think now it's going for 105 years, this research being conducted. It's a very interesting study. They want to determine the life expectancy between people who have a shorter height and those who have a taller height. And in that study, started in the 90s. I think it was 1908. So if you research or you Google the study, it's quite interesting. Even studies such as COVID and coronavirus, they are more longitudinal because we're talking about a study that monitors human behavior, the same person over time. So in that interesting that I was talking about, what they want to do, they want to compare people who are tall and people who are short, and basically see which one live a longer life. Interesting enough, I don't know whether you are tall or long or short, but I want you to think about the assumption which one live longer. Just for a second, that becomes your hypothesis of a study. So they have to monitor these people each and every year and compare them on the same basis. Maybe they live in the same country, they get same type of nutrition, health, and so on. And then up until the death. So that's why it's a longitudinal study. So in longitudinal studies, secondary data becomes important because you'll always refer to what happened previous years. So that's why secondary data is used in longitudinal studies. So in summary, these are the important uses of secondary data. And now we're gonna look in terms of the types and sources of secondary data. In the textbook, if you follow, we are on page 90. So now on page 90, types and sources of secondary data, we've got two types of secondary data. The first one is internal or external. And I think this is self-explanatory, meaning that we understand internal and external, what it means. But in the textbook, they further define it. So you also want to highlight the first sentence on page 90, where they say secondary data is classified in terms of its source, internal or external. And in a research proposal, I'm going to quickly exit the slide. In a research proposal, you will see there, you've got secondary data, discussion. This is where you will define it. So you will provide a discussion, but don't rock the boat, meaning that we can work smarter. Instead of looking for those definitions, remember you already have them in this proposal. So if you come to data collection, you've got a summary of that definition there. And then you will see there it says internal and external, and this is what we are discussing now. So internal source as well as external source on page 90. So they will go to the research proposal, this part. So let's start with the source. The source is in-house. We only have one source. So once you return, if it's an internal data, which means it's the data within the organization, like it's defined on page 90. And then you've got some examples that you can use on the slides. For example, the invoices, the sales reports, the financial statement. The first three, they usually apply to general sources of secondary data, not marketing sources. I must be specific. These are financial sources most of the time. So in marketing, we usually look into the last one. So previous research surveys, which were conducted by this organization, they become more helpful than to look into the profits and so on. But I don't mean that the profits will not be helpful. Obviously, things such as prices, we manipulate that in marketing research, and that's what we look at in the marketing mix, the variables that we manipulate. So the price, so things such as invoices, they might be useful somewhere when we conduct our research in terms of manipulating the price element. But previous research is the most used one. So in the textbook, I need you to highlight as well line number 4 on page 90. And then line number 4, where it says research surveys previously conducted for enterprise. That is another source that you'll have to look into. It's not limited to this. Sometimes the case study will tell you some of the ideas. For example, the case study might talk about that a previous questionnaire is attached, or a questionnaire that was used to collect the data. I think we did have some sort of a case study giving us a questionnaire. I think it's the one about the health. Or not yet. Okay, I think not yet. It's just in a trail of thought. The questionnaire, the case study might tell you about provide you with a questionnaire that was used to collect secondary data, and that you can indicate that an example of secondary data is previous questionnaire as well here. It's not limited to this. You can also think more as long as that data or that source is within the organization. The market also plays a role there. And then we've got different sources of external secondary data. The first one on page 91, syndicated data, where it says organization that conduct research and sell results to multiple organizations. So you can also highlight that one on page 91. It's the first sentence under syndicated data there. And then they give you some examples there, which are similar to the one on the slides. But there is more, quite a lot of research organizations. So basically here we're talking about a research company. So in brackets, maybe add with pencil or a pen in the textbook itself and just write there research company. So, or research companies. So research companies, basically most of the time, that's our role as marketing researchers. We want to conduct our own research, have our own company, or work for a research company at some stage. And then we will collect data, meaning that we'll interview respondents based on the problem, and then we will sell that information to other organizations. For example, we can sell information about consumer usage of Wi-Fi to things such as MTN, Vodacom, and so on. Or we can conduct research about the influence of promotions such as Black Fridays and so on, and we can sell that information and the findings to retailers and so on. So these are the organizations, they conduct research. You can also hire them to do this for you, but you must take note, if you hire them to conduct research for you, they will not be collecting secondary data. They will be collecting primary data because that will be new data. So what it means here is that you actually buy information that was collected for another purpose. So you are not hiring them. In this case, you are basically buying their research reports. That could be your source. The second source, we've got the pool data, which is a research data shared among interested organizations. And in terms of this one, the pooled data, we're talking about the research data that is shared among the interested organizations. So what it means here is that we've got an industry, and then in that industry, you've got different companies. For example, the banking industry. I will use the banking industry here as an example, which it's in the it's regulated by Credit Bureau. Basically, they have data that they shared among themselves. For example, that's why we are able to use our bank card at different ATMs. Speaking of that, please tell Capitec people that their card works on ABSA ATM as well as Standard Bank ATM. There's always a line for Capitec. So you will see that if you use your card, or for example, or you get blacklisted from one bank, the other bank will be able to have that information that you are blacklisted. So our source here are the ones that they share information. It also applies to the motor industry. The example that they give you there about the motor industry, you will see most of the features of recent cars or old cars or new cars, they are similar. It's because the they are actually sharing the data among themselves. For example, talking about things such as your indicators, the way they change nowadays, no longer blinking and so on. And you're talking about things such as CarPlay and so on. All these features is because they have an organization, they are an organization, and then they share this data among themselves. So that could be a source of secondary data as well that you can suggest for a research proposal. Other published sources in the textbook on page 91 at the bottom of the page, where it says other published sources, this is the one that you're gonna use the most. So I would rather highlight that one and write NB next to it in the textbook, because this is where you find published information. And in academic world, we talk about the published articles, the research journal articles. For example, right now, if I wanna develop a research proposal or I'm conducting research regarding COVID-19, my source, as I'm sharing the screen, I will usually come here, which is Google. But since we are academics, we will use Google Scholar, and I need you to write that in the textbook itself as well, because this is our source, Google Scholar. I just want to share what it does for you. So on Google Scholar is a search engine that is specifically designed for you to search journal articles. So you will see there is COVID-19 articles published. So this is scientific research, basically. And then you will see 2020 article and so on. So it does not search the entire internet. It simply search the published articles. So in the textbook, where it says other published source, you're gonna write search journal articles on Google Scholar, which I've just illustrated now. What that means is that when you come to a research proposal, how do you propose you're gonna collect external secondary data? You will say you'll see other published sources already on the research proposal. Hence, I said most of the time, this is a source that we are using. So you will be indicating that for this research proposal search, you'll write something similar to this: journal articles on Google Scholar. So our source is Google Scholar regarding the topic. So in this case, whatever the topic that you're talking about, or in the assessment, if the assessment is about alcohol advertising or influence of advertising, so I will be saying regarding alcohol. I will search articles regarding alcohol, regarding advertising. So I will list the elements and consumption. And we can see that you are able to practically apply the information. So this one is the most important one. I have to emphasize that other published sources is the source that we use most of the time. And the textbook does not give you that search engine, Google Scholar, so you're gonna write that one down. And that's how you actually write that information. I hope that is clear. And then lastly, we used to have a source called database, which is on page 92. But the database, you will see on the slide, I've scratched it out because it's outdated. We're no longer using databases now to collect secondary data. If we do use the database, it will be computer format. So in the textbook, I will suggest you highlight the computer database, and then you talk about the computer database instead of the paper-based format one. Because a database, it's where basically going to, for example, a library. And then if you go to the library, that will be print paper based. That is an example. Going to the library to read about the most of the time is the theories that do not change. So you can still use the print paper based, although it's outdated, it's still relevant. And then computerized, maybe you search on the internet, but database is external in this case, meaning that it's owned by another organization. So it became kind of outdated because external sources or external companies no longer provide this service, but feel free to provide practical examples as long as it's relevant if it applies to a case study. You will see other published sources, like I've indicated. It also covers database. That's why, in a way, if you have this one and you leave that one, it becomes more clearer for you. For example, anything that is published in the textbook, it's in the other published sources. So this was usually a room full of information regarding a specific topic. They still have that on the computerized format. For example, you're talking about things such as your yellow pages. We can refer to it as a database for telephone numbers, but it's more computer. And you will, if you think about the yellow pages, you'll see that's why we say it's outdated. Nowadays, people no longer use that big book. Lastly, we're going to talk about how you evaluate whether secondary data, you can use it or you cannot use it. How reliable is secondary data? So in the textbook, you're going to go to page 93. Of secondary data. And we talk about this element. So in the slide here, I've kind of like summarized what you look for. So basically what it means with the evaluation of secondary data is that you will go to Google Scholar, download articles regarding the topic that you're investigating. Once you have downloaded those articles, you have to evaluate them if they are reliable or not, but as long as it's on Google Scholar, the nice thing is that it's reliable. But things such as newspaper articles, things such as your social media articles, you want to evaluate that information, because if you use information that is not reliable, it have a huge impact on your study. You can consider relevant or recent examples whereby there was a woman which was indicated that she had 10 babies, and now it's more like the story was not reliable, but it was published. We saw it on the news and so on, and they apologized. So you can see the image or the impact of reliability or of evaluating the source of your secondary data. So these are the elements that we evaluate secondary data or secondary sources or the articles. The first one is the purpose on page 93. This one, it talks about how does the secondary data relate to the current study. So you look at the purpose of that study. What was the purpose for them to collect that secondary information? Are they collecting that secondary information for a same purpose as you are collecting your primary research data? Because you will be conducting research now and you'll have the purpose. You want to compare that purpose with what they've done. So some studies, they will collect information for a different purpose than you, and then we cannot rely on their secondary data, on that secondary data. For example, a study about political, something political or things in politics, it might be biased for us to use it because that study was conducted with a certain agenda. So we look at the purpose, why they conducted that research first. Secondly, we look at the accuracy, what was measured. So we go to the research instrument. For us to find out what was measured, we're going to look into the questionnaire. The questionnaire is the measurement tool that we use in marketing research. So we look at their questionnaire, what questions they ask respondents. And then if those questions are similar to the questions that we want to ask, we can use that secondary data. But if they ask different questions, it's not accurate. So it's not the same as our study. So we can say no. So basically, when you evaluate it here, it's about, yes, I can use this article. No, I cannot use this article based on all these elements. An example is that you will find a lot of research journal articles having the similar topic, but they did not ask same questions. So, and what they've collected based on that questions have a huge impact on the findings. So you want to look at the accuracy in terms of the questions. Consistency. How consistent is data compared to other study? This is more important, but we must not just look into how consistent is data of that article compared to other sources without thinking hard and looking in the results. So what this element means is that you will collect secondary data. Let's say you've got 10 articles, and then these 10 articles, you say, I want to use them for my research project. I want to look into the literature review in these 10 articles. So those 10 articles, you will compare their findings. If 5 of them have similar findings and the other 5 have similar findings, you will see that there is consistency there. Or if all of them have similar findings, for example, all of them say, let's use COVID-19 as an example here. If all those 10 articles says wearing of mask is effective to prevent coronavirus, and those are the findings, then we can say basically these 10 articles are consistent. If one of them it says wearing of mask is not effective, we see inconsistency there, which meaning that one article is not consistent with other articles, and then it becomes less reliable to use those articles where they are not consistent with others. So most of the time we want our secondary data to be consistent in their findings. Credibility. Is the organization and publication reliable source? This one, it applies to Google Scholar. If you're using Google Scholar, we already know that the organization that published there, these are reliable sources. Let me quickly illustrate that part. So if you come to the website Google Scholar here, you will see all these are articles, but they are published under different journals. For example, this one is published where it says Springer. This one is published under New England Journal of Medicine. This one is published under BMJ Journal and so on. So we want to look in terms of whether these publications are reliable sources. The nice thing about Google Scholar is that everything that is here is a reliable source. Hence, they've made this search engine to be a Google Scholar to only show you reliable publications. But if you are searching an article here, meaning that maybe you search a research article here, you will find some sources that are not credible. For example, your Facebook and so on, they also published information about the post of users and so on. So if a user posts something, it can be available there. And then you cannot use search or Wikipedia. Wikipedia in academic world, it's not a credible source because anyone can change information and so on. And please add that at the back of your head that you should never reference Wikipedia in your marketing research proposal. So is the organization and publication reliable sources? We're gonna look in. We also look into that. For example, another example that I would like to use in terms of newspapers here is because some of the time we wanna reference stories that were published in a newspaper magazine. So if you're gonna compare a story published on Daily Sun with another story published on Sowetan website, and you look at these two organizations, you will have to think about which one is more reliable, is more credible source, and so on. So that also counts. Methodology, it talks about how data was collected. Consider data collection methods and field workers, because how you collected data affect your results. For example, if data is collected by telephones, we already know that these people, they are not sure, the people that they were interviewing, they are not sure that are the real people that they were supposed to interview, because that's one huge setback with telephone interviews. You can interview a wrong person. So it could also be something such as by where they used something such as in-depth interview, where it means they use qualitative focus groups interviews instead of using a survey, meaning instead of using a quantitative. So we look at the methodology that was used. What we want the methods that they used to be the same as the one that we are proposing as well here. And then we can say it's more reliable, we can use that. We also have to talk about whereby you see a researcher making a mistake using a wrong method in their journal article. So for example, you find out that they were conducting interview about something such as HIV and AIDS, something that is sensitive, or something such as the salaries or income of respondents. And then they've used a data collection method which was maybe telephone, or meaning that people could have lied there. It's not a reliable data collection method that they've used. They were supposed to actually basically use something such as experiment, look into the data itself and so on. So we question the methodology that was used in that case. Bias, reason why the data was collected. Some data are biased, or some research projects are biased, like I've made an example of political parties. Those are biased. Most of the time they are conducted for a specific reason to push a certain agenda. And then if the data is biased or the research is more biased, we cannot use that. We want a free and fair research findings. And lastly, currency. When was the data collected? Is it fresh or outdated? In the textbook, I need you to add with a pen or a pencil. It's on page 94. Currency, the last one. You write there 5 years. 5 years, it's when we can say the data is in the textbook, I see they talk about an example, for example, 20 years. They're making an example of 20 years, which meaning that that data is outdated. If an article was published more than 5 years ago, most of the time it's no longer up to date. Fresh articles or fresh results are usually data that is published in the last 5 years. So when you evaluate, if you find an article and you wanted to use that article for your research proposal, and that article was published in 1994, you may want to question that article and say, I can no longer use what they proposed there, because we live in a different era now. It's 2021. So we want fresh data. So 5 years is the one that you can use there. Just to recap, ladies and gentlemen, so this is chapter 6, and this is what goes to your research proposal. So in your research proposal, what you wanna do, you wanna read the case study, and then after reading the case study, it might give you an idea of what sources of internal secondary data that they can use. There is only one source that you can reference there, but your practical example should be practical enough. It must be within the organization, for example, previous research and so on. So for chapter 6, we're only adding these two on a research proposal. And like I've indicated, primary data is the next chapters, chapter 7 and chapter 8. So in terms of your assessment, I'm quickly gonna exit the screen here. Lastly, in terms of your assessment, I will communicate details regarding your next assessment, which is assessment 3, but it will be based on chapter 1 to chapter 6, excluding chapter 7. So we will continue with online class sessions as we receive communication, and I will keep you up to date. So before I end the class, I need to know if you are happy. So in the chat box, You can write any comment there. You can use any face there, and then we can leave. Thank you very much for participating today. I will end the session here today. I will stop the recording now for a video. So have a lovely week. Yebo.
Is the game still available?
No, because it was a live game, so the game is no longer available. It was a live game, so it could only be available while we were doing it during class.
Okay, thank you, sir.
All right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I hope there is no any other question. If there is, you can ask. Okay, enjoy the week. We'll communicate further. Bye-bye.